Is Congress about to completely collapse because of the absolute stupidest issue anyone can think of? It could. This is my Newsweek article called The Coming Congressional Meltdown Over a Phantom Menace. I'll tell you what the issue is, why it's so stupid, how we've proved that it's stupid, how it's mostly Republicans' fault, but with a dash of responsibility for Democrats, and where this is all likely to go next. Here it is. Don't look now, but the political parties are increasingly likely to collapse into their ugliest dysfunction in memory. And it's over an issue that makes 2025's gerrymandering spat, previous record holder for stupid, destructive cell phone politics, look positively Einsteinian by comparison. For decades, Republicans have ridden the political hobby horse of trying to pass voter ID laws, both at the state and federal level. They've obsessively claimed that America needs strict new federal standards to verify voter identities and prevent fraud, particularly the threat of non-citizen voting. But it's a ghost story. Study after study has shown that voter fraud of any kind is virtually non-existent. The Heritage Foundation, the most influential conservative think tank, and the folks behind Project 2025, found only 10 cases involving in-person impersonation fraud and 41 cases involving non-citizens registering, voting, or attempting to vote out of billions of votes cast. And not for lack of looking. And the most comprehensive review of non-citizen voting looked at 23.5 million votes in areas with high immigrant populations and found just 30 suspected cases. That's 0.0001%. So you're 5 times more likely to be struck by lightning or attacked by a shark than to ever find a fraudulent vote in America. Heck, you're more likely to die in a sharknado. Plus, the whole idea is absurd. It's already illegal for non-citizens to vote. The extraordinarily rare cases that happen leave a clear paper trail. States regularly check. Why would non-citizens intentionally commit such an obvious crime, one where they're super likely to get caught, to shift a single vote? The thing is, congressional Republicans aren't dumb. They know that their substantive case is weaker than the writing for the movie Melania. They know that their new steroidal version of voter ID, the SAVE Act, which requires Americans to show a passport or driver's license plus birth certificate to register, will likely disenfranchise most of the 21 million American citizens currently unable to access those additional documents, including married women who chose to change their name. And they know that wiping out the rights of almost 10% of voting age U.S. citizens to stop a handful of illegitimate votes per election is insane. But they also know that these millions of disenfranchised citizens would come disproportionately from groups that tend to support Democrats more. They're also acutely aware that over 80% of Americans who pay little attention to policy details vaguely support some form of voter ID. And they know they need to change the current media narrative. For a party and a president drowning on nearly every issue, even Fox News agrees, this seems like a lifeboat, which is why President Donald Trump and allied activists are trying to jawbone Republican senators and forcing Senate Democrats into an old-fashioned, weeks-long, Mr. Smith goes to Washington-esque talking filibuster on the SAVE Act. Never mind that it would functionally shut down Congress while we're at war with Iran, weighing Trump's new round of tariffs, and trying to deal with an economy sputtering under persistently high inflation and practically zero job creation. For Republicans, redirecting public focus by talking this phantom problem to death is a feature, not a bug, especially if they ultimately kill the filibuster, pass the bill, and knock a bunch of Democrats off the voter rolls. If anyone can find a more cynical move than paralyzing Congress to throw red meat to your political base and or crush citizens' constitutional rights in a Hail Mary bid to salvage a few seats in the midterm while the country groans under the weight of real problems, I'm all ears, especially because this bill amounts to closing a right-wing doom loop. All the Republicans shrieking about non-citizen votes is what cratered public trust in elections among Republicans, and only Republicans, not other voters, in the first place, which is why their base is in their leaders' ears demanding that they go to the mattresses. They think this ghost is real. Republicans came up with a non-solution to a fake problem that they themselves created, and their voters bought into it so much that they might be forced to go through with a whole charade. To be sure, Democrats could have lanced this political boil when they held power by passing a compromise voter ID law that gave citizens free and easy access to documents. But that's 2020 hindsight. Will this maneuver work? Depressingly, maybe, but maybe not. Polls already show that only 32% of voters think Trump has the right priorities. And this issue is not what most voters want to see their government stalling over when they can't afford their bills. Not to mention that voters paying more attention to the paper-thin fiction that Republicans are selling here might not be a great idea for them. Polling drops precipitously when people realize that Republican voter ID laws make it hard for actual citizens to vote. Either way, we may be approaching a true low point in an otherwise appalling political era. So that's the article, and I'll note that since I wrote this 2 weeks ago, Republican Senate Majority Leader John Thune has said he's not going to cave in to all those demands for a talking filibuster. But in a Truth Social post, President Donald Trump has drawn a red line, saying that nothing else can become law until the SAVE Act has passed, because he will not sign any other bills. And so, we may very well end up with the stupidest congressional meltdown in history. So, Matt, that was our deep dive explainer on the underlying issue. And I want to pick up on something that I said as part of the Newsweek piece. Republicans aren't dumb, at least the ones I know, like you. So could you explain for the rest of us what's really happening inside the Republican mind on this? Is this issue totally cynical because that's the way Democrats tend to see it? Could you just walk through what's really going on here?
If you apply truth serum to Republican operatives, we're going to agree with you. Voter fraud is rare. It does exist. Look, there's a video from Bridgeport where an individual was caught on camera stuffing absentee ballots into a drop box. In 2018 in North Carolina, there was one in Paterson, New Jersey in 2020 where they illegally collected and submitted mail ballots. But if you notice what I said here, those are all ballot handling problems. Those are collection, custody, and enforcement. They're not non-citizen voting. Now, we will 100% say we do need voter ID. It is something that is a good safety step. But at the end of the day, we're not really looking at an election saying, I know what, let's prevent illegal aliens. We're dealing with much more mechanical issues.
What I hear you saying is there is an issue of principle involved for serious people.
Yes.
Who happen to be Republicans.
Yes.
You think there's a sanctity to voting. You're concerned about chain of custody, which is some of the concern that we've heard around mail-in voting and drop boxes. You are willing to admit under Truth Serum that the real problems, few and far between as they may be, have been leveraged cynically by certain people, predominantly in your party. Is that a fair?
Yeah, that is fair. Its core principle is that the integrity of our system must be upheld. And tales of stolen elections are fairy tales. They're bedtime stories meant to frighten people. It would take an Ocean's 11 magnitude kind of caper, if you will, to have stolen an election the way that has been alleged by some in my party.
And to be clear on that point, it has happened in American history, right? It notably happened in 1948 for LBJ and his Senate election, where the election was absolutely positively stolen. It is a very likely historic fact that the 1960 presidential election was substantially affected by some kind of voter fraud in Illinois and in Texas. That kind of fraud occurred. Cannot be done because of the protections that are in place these days. I want to take a dose of Truth Serum myself because I wrote on Alternet in 2021 an article saying that Democrats should cut a deal. And it's not because I buy into Republicans' voter fraud bullshit. It's because I recognize the point you're making, that there is an issue of principle that I can respect. But I also recognize the political reality, which is we had a moment where Democrats held power, and this was going to come up over and over again. And as I said in that video piece, we could have lanced this particular boil. And there is a deal to be had here. We could have voter ID, which, by the way, the majority of states have some version of voter ID today.
Yeah, exactly.
And we could make those identifying documents free and easy to access for American citizens. That would be a win-win for everyone. And to the extent that your concern and serious Republicans' concern is, well, what about chain of custody? We could address that too. I believe in the kind of more conservative approach to this, which is elections are supposed to be run by states, and we should let different approaches proliferate in different states. States that want to do a lot of mail-in voting should be allowed to do it. But would I be willing to strike some kind of a federal standard deal that reduces the amount of mail-in voting, but increases an early voting window for easy access in-person voting, so we don't have these crazy disproportionate lines in African American precincts that create a barrier to certain Americans voting? Could we make easy in-person, easy access voting more of a thing and limit mail-in voting to groups that truly need it for their convenience? There's probably a deal to be had.
There's a lot of layers that come into this. When you hear Republicans talk about election integrity, not stolen elections is something different. That's a made up animal. When we talk about election integrity, it's about preserving the sanctity of our elections. The problem is the president has made it impossible for us to talk about those things. A lot of Republicans like me say, okay, it just makes sense to have voter ID laws, but we do have to make sure that it is not so rigid. When you get to the SAVE Act, as a conservative, my first problem, and you touched on this, is it federalizes election administration. There are states that have different issues in Alaska than you have in South Carolina and up in the Northeast. This whole mail-in voting is another made-up boogeyman, because the reality of the situation is in states that do it well, there is a chain of custody there. 1 in 4 Republicans actually vote by mail. If you take away 25% of those voters and now you hope that they show up on election day, you're going to lose some of those. I mean, this is not a conservative bill. It is a bad bill. If you just did voter ID, I think you could get a lot of people out there, but the rest of this stuff is garbage. And it's an attempt by Trump to be able to create something to justify losing or to create a boogeyman to try to rally people around. I'm already seeing fundraising emails on it. Again, if I'm taking a dose of truth serum, these are not the problems that we face on elections.
And they're not also the problems that are the most pressing for most
Right.
Americans. And
Right.
so just to try to wrap this up, I think we can agree that the vast majority of the reason we're even talking about this is that very cynical political people have been using this issue for years now, and Trump is just doing the steroids version of it to try to raise money, create big boogeymen, to try to blame other people for their losses. I'm looking at you, Don. And maybe if they succeed, to gain a partisan advantage by disproportionately kicking Democrats who are American citizens off of voter rolls. It's wrong, cynical, immoral, underhanded, anti-democratic, and about 5 other adjectives that I'm not going to bore people with. I can respect the legitimate issues. I don't think they're an emergency. I think the only reason that there's any urgency to this is that Republicans spent years screaming fraud, rigging, there's a problem, until the base started to believe it. So this is a problem among your own voters of your own creation. I think there are some legitimate issues with voting, and I think they are addressable. There are compromises to be had. I can respect the principle that there should be some kind of identification. And I think for political reasons, for political, pragmatic, smart, strategic reasons, Democrats should have addressed this a long time ago by making a deal, making documents easy to get, making sure that there was the easiest possible form of voter ID and getting this issue dealt with once and for all. But instead, we're living with it again. And hopefully this will be the last time we deal with it for now, but I have a sinking feeling that it is going to come back soon.